I'm Kristen Puryear. I'm an ecologist with the Maine Natural Areas Program, and I'm going to talk about our sea level rise modeling and how it's been integrated into conservation planning in Maine. And just at the start, I'd like to John Cameron and Justin Schlauen from our program, who you may have heard on the last week's webinar. They both have had a hand in the various stages of this work. So as you may have heard before, the Maine Natural Areas Program, we are the natural heritage program for the state with the mission of mapping and tracking rare plants and rare or high quality natural communities and sharing that information with landowners and managers and resource agencies for conservation and development planning. Tidal marshes are among those rare natural community types, which is why we've dedicated efforts over the past 2 years towards mapping, evaluating, and assessing the condition of tidal marshes. In total, we have just about 22,000 acres of tidal marsh, and we recognize 4 different types in our natural community classification, ranging from salty, Spartina type, to brackish, to freshwater tidal. And you can see them here. They're enhanced with that blue color just so they all show up on the map. So quick outline, the purpose of today's presentation is to share the net results of this tidal marsh work, much of which was funded by a 2015 EPA Wetland Program Development Grant, and demonstrate how this has all culminated as far as integration in conservation planning and expansion of our wetland program at MNAP, basically bringing all this tidal marsh documentation into what seems to be an ever-expanding world of work related to marsh resiliency and sea level rise planning. I'll break down our work as follows: marshes present, and then marshes future, that's the modeling, and marshes in planning, and finally a quick glimpse at what's next. The Portland, Maine tide gauge data show that sea level rise has risen 1.9 millimeters per year, just shy of 7.5 inches over the last century. And over the last 10 to 20 years, that rate has been increasing both in Maine and, as you know, globally. Recent measurements here shown in red show a rate of about 3 to 4 millimeters per year, which gives us a trajectory of just over 12 inches per century. And of course, this has the potential to increase at an even more rapid rate. Generally, marshes may respond by either keeping up with sediment accumulation being key, or marshes may move laterally inland to where land cover and topography allow. While some of both may happen, it's generally thought that marsh migration will be critical to the persistence of this community and habitat, since some marshes are already degraded or will be unable to maintain the sediment supply needed. So the key to predicting that response is in monitoring sediment accretion, and in 2017, the Maine Coastal Program, which is part of the Department of Marine Resources, deployed 27 RSETs to supplement the handfuls that are already out there. But of course, after a year, there is nothing to report. This is just the start of more robust long-term monitoring. But I bring this up because it's important context as it influenced how we pursued marsh migration modeling for Maine. So this transitions us now to Marsh's future. Using the high-resolution LiDAR data you've all seen, the Maine Geological Survey created a bathtub model to simulate sea level rise statewide. So starting with their starting point was highest tide, and you can see this floods out to the 6-foot sea level rise as the extreme scenario. And NGS just updated it to reflect the new suite of potential sea level rise scenarios put out by the 2018 National Climate Assessment, which has that extreme scenario hitting 10.9 feet. So as next steps, we obviously need to update these slides, and we'll potentially update the associated modeling, which I'll touch on towards the end. By using these sea level rise simulations, we could run some calculations to get a sense for impact and opportunities. To breeze through a couple results here, we noted that there is quite a difference between different parts of the coast. You can see just the images on the top right, where the north has less developed coastal area than the south. Also, under 1 meter sea level rise, we could stand to lose over 50% of our marsh area, but that is if we assume that marshes are not keeping up anywhere. and that may not or is likely not to be the case. It's an extreme assumption, but it does give us some perspective on the value of understanding marsh, know how critical that marsh migration space will be. In addition, we found that as sea level rises, the marsh migration space intersects less and less with conserved land, presenting plenty of opportunity. That's in the graph on the bottom right, or the table on the bottom right. So there's plenty of opportunity for conservation, since much of that marsh migration space, on average across the state, is still in natural land cover, as you can see in the pie chart on the bottom. So from here, we started working under the 2015 EPA grant, and that gave us the lift that we needed to move forward with modeling efforts that would help direct attention toward places that not only had the potential for marsh migration, but also had impact buffers, which of course will provide habitat connectivity and filtration and support toward ecosystem services that these marshes are known for. So to create something that would resonate with partners, we assembled a coastal resiliency opportunities work group. It included members from state and federal agencies, NGOs, planners, and coastal restoration practitioners in Maine, and you'll see a list at the end of my talk. Primarily, we wanted to make sure that the model was something that would be easy to interpret, that would not work against or be redundant with other efforts, and hopefully that people would want to use. There's a lot of words here, so the key takeaways are really that we wanted to identify areas that have the potential to accommodate the migration of coastal wetlands and supporting buffers in order to prioritize conservation actions and inform restoration planning. So basically a tool that people could use to guide restoration or protection of habitat connectivity or increase conservation of natural areas that can protect human communities from storm surge or tidal flooding. And that may be more important in southern and mid-coast parts of the state, down eastern parts of the state where there's less of a population on the coast. The information was developed with the agreed upon premise down below that the model would be easy to interpret, that it'd be easy to update or modify with new data. And as I noted above, this data is already essentially needed given the new climate assessment numbers. And that the model would limit assumptions, which the group felt was really important because of our data set of sediment accretion rates. And people did not want to just plug in numbers that were from other coastal areas and run everything from there. So the model we ended up with building did not incorporate any assumptions about accretion rates. With input from the work group, MNAP created what we called the Coastal Undeveloped Block model. We made it a static model based on 1 meter of sea level rise projection, which was considered a moderate projection for the year 2100. And you can see here where the current tidal marsh is, just on either side of that curve. The future tidal marsh zone is in green. And then we applied a 300-meter non-tidal buffer that's about 1,000 feet to that projected 1 meter sea level rise zone, basically to incorporate the inland areas that are adjacent to marshes that provide connectivity within and between coastal systems and can mitigate stressors to marshes that decrease their resilience over time. Next, we characterized the future marsh migration zones, and this was done differently than other models we may be familiar with. So we used existing land cover data to determine future coastal habitat types, so information like NWI and our own field mapped marsh and estuarine data, and also a data set we have, which is the coastal marine geologic environment, which includes sand or gravel, beaches, dunes, rocky shorelines, that kind of thing. And so by putting these on the map, we then made a rule that any future coastal habitat area under a 1 meter sea level rise scenario would be tagged as the type it's adjacent to. So let me explain that here. Here you can see the future coastal habitat is typed as salt marsh in green because it's adjacent to what is currently salt marsh. And by contrast, down by the water, you can see in orange what's mapped to be potentially sand or gravel beach and dunes, is right adjacent to what's currently beach and dunes. So this is a pretty simplistic assumption, and it's not the key takeaway from the model, but it at least reveals the variability and diversity of coastal habitats associated with a current system and considerations for the future. And the next element of the modeling was to add impervious surface. We have a high-resolution data set for that. And then we added this 250-foot buffer, which I refer to as a zone of influence for that impervious surface. And then when you erase that, you get these nuggets of future coastal habitats and the impact corridors and corridors of buffer adjacent to that future habitat. So basically, it draws your eye towards these places where there's future coastal habitats associated with inland buffers. And it doesn't mean if you had a conservation project that you wouldn't also work on the land going all the way up to the road. It's more just to distill the landscape down to those places where you want it to put attention. So in summary for this model, this is what the sea level rise and coastal undeveloped walk data can show, is intersection with infrastructure where there might be a conservation and restoration nexus. It displays large or connected areas of future tidal marsh, which are vital for habitat and ecosystem services. Also shows large or connected areas of marsh buffer for mitigating stressors and supporting healthy marshes and coastal systems. And it can be applied across multiple scales, whether within a land trust service area or on a regional scale to help stratify sites regionally or locally. What it's not is a prioritization. This model was really designed to be considered part of a decision-making toolkit that can be applied strategically. And what we heard from our work group and partners, and as you likely know, is that almost any land conservation or management decision is going to be made with various priorities and realities in mind, such as planning horizon or funding or landowner willingness or conservation values, which can range from rare species to recreation. So people were not necessarily looking for a prioritization ranking of 1 to 100. Also, some groups are only working within one water town, and where they have a locally significant marshes that they're already aware of, those are their priorities, but under a statewide prioritization, they may find themselves suddenly below the top tier, which doesn't make anyone feel good. So also in Maine, we have a big difference south to north, where some marshes are surrounded by development and others have contiguous buffers. So the inherent social values of functions like floodwater storage and significance of stressors actually vary greatly between marshes and portions of the coast. So here's a few examples of how modeling. As you can see with this map, this is in southern Maine, near the coast of New Hampshire. Those areas of future coastal habitats and intact buffers, they jump out on this regional scale. And in this case, a watershed committee that had formed for reviewing potential designation of a new wild and scenic river asked for this information. It was also incorporated into a regional partnership to identify areas of, and as a result, some of these sites became the subject of targeted field survey, especially that one with all that future tidal marsh in dark green on the left. A more local example is this one, where a land trust wanted to update its strategic conservation plan to include information on marsh migration potential and figure out a way to rank or evaluate new conservation opportunities through that lens. And so now the land trust includes a review of the scenarios and the undeveloped block modeling in their checklist of values that help them make decisions within their lands committee and on their board. Thinking beyond this more simple model, though, we and others did want to know what really floats to the top on the side landscape scale. Not so much a prioritization, but to find where there are stellar opportunities out there that we should pay attention to. So we asked, where are the coastal landscapes that have large existing marshes and will have relatively large future marshes, contain undeveloped complex shorelines, and have impact buffers. This is really getting at some of those bedrock concepts of resiliency and viability, like size and condition and complexity, to see what areas of the coast really jump out as what we came to call a highly resilient coastal area. And I'm going to go through this model pretty quickly, but hopefully it's enough to give you the basic idea of its use and value. So the first element, complexity, which was made up of calculations of current and future marsh area in acres relative to shoreline length. So to give you an idea of what that looks like, the search image was with blueberry pie. We being Mainers, we compare all things to blueberries. So this pie on the left represents marsh with a very long shoreline, and all those little crenulations offer up niches of biodiversity, and the less complex shoreline on the right, the brownie, does not. So thinking of all the inlets and coves and brackish transition areas and tidal streams, et cetera, of a more complex shoreline. So that was kind of our search image there. So using these inputs of shoreline complexity, in this case, coastline length, and both current future tidal marsh size, we scored marshes within each estuary from 0 to 100, 100 having the highest degree of complexity. So here's an example. This is the undeveloped coastal block mapping you saw before. And you can see the current tidal marsh is in striped green, future tidal marsh in dark green. And if you take note on that northeast corner lobe there, where there's the least extensive amount of tidal marsh, I'm going to flip to the map that shows the complexity scoring. So here's what the final complexity score was, and you can see the results sorted out here in quantile ranks, where the top percentiles are in the dark blue, working down. I'm not sure if I can toggle back, but that's why I told you to look at the northeast corner. So where there was the least amount of marsh, you can see here that final complexity score was a little lower than other areas. Although throughout the coast, some of that was tempered by the presence of a long or a complex shoreline. The second element of the model is condition. And so we used development percent cover and proximity as a surrogate for condition in this case. And here we looked at the size of the unfragmented portion of the landscape around the marsh, as well as the amount of undeveloped shoreline, or the length of undeveloped shoreline. So essentially the landscape context is marsh, future marsh. And here you can say same site where the transparency, that transparent color, shows the extent of the undeveloped block associated with the marsh. And then in this image here, you can see the final condition score, which is pretty high, and it's due to, in part, that relative lack of development or fragmentation around the marsh. And what I didn't show you, which was the overall undeveloped shoreline. So again, this scoring is broken out as quantile ranks. And so you're seeing the 90th percentile in darker blue, just for the condition. But we're not done. The condition and complexity scores are all rolled up or averaged in this case to produce a final rank for each marsh. And in this example used here, you can see that the model suggests that there are certain areas within the larger system that may carry more potential to support marsh function into the future, and that overall this tidal area ranks fairly high, 80th percentile or higher. So the key message that carries with this model is that it is best used at a statewide or large ecoregional scale and should be used based on the final score rather than comparing carefully at each of its components. So just using that final score. With this statewide stratification, we also wanted to know where the conservation opportunities existed. So among the top sites, we asked which were poorly conserved. And here you can see the locations of tidal systems that the modeling suggests are in the top 10% for resiliency, so the 90th percentile, and were found to be less than 50% conserved. That was just the threshold. So based on this selection, MNAP actually we started conducting field surveys of these conservation opportunity areas, as we call them, in 2016 and 17 to better evaluate on-the-ground conditions of the marshes and the buffers, and then share that information with the landowners. You can note here that two of the conservation planning examples I gave earlier, the land trust example and the watershed planning group example, I've circled in blue and green. And they actually turn out to be among those conservation opportunity areas where there's a lot of potential. So good news, people are thinking about these places. Also thinking about these places is Maine Coast Heritage Trust, which is a statewide coastal land trust. And MCHT has used our highly resilient coastal area information to identify their marsh migration planning sites. So basically it's a tool to stratify the entire coast of Maine for the top 20% of sites. They set their threshold a little bit lower at that 80th percentile. And so many of the orange opportunity areas you see here now fall within their marsh migration planning areas, plus some others. So here, I'm borrowing from MCHT, they've taken the modeling, this is the highly resilient coastal areas for one particular estuary larger watershed. And then they've adapted it further by adding parcel data and conservation land information, showing proximity of development to the marsh, et cetera, to really drill down on individual sites and make land use decisions or strategic conservation decisions. So again, they used our model to stratify the coast and then took a fine kind of scalpel approach to making their own decisions and their own map. To summarize these models and applications, there's really no one-size-fits-all approach to using them. Are part of that toolkit for land use or land conservation. The sea level rise and undeveloped coastal block data are available on viewers on our website and also on MC's Coastal Resiliency app, and the highly resilient coastal areas we are using now in for field survey and CHT is using, as I just explained. So just a quick wrap up, a quick mention of next steps and how this works really catalyzed the projects and helped integrate our survey and assessment efforts. We did quite a bit of information exchange with TNC when they were developing their Northeast Resilience Space modeling, and we have assisted with the RSET. We used our Tidal Marsh mapping data to assist with RSET site selection and then help with deployment. And then we're bringing the Tidal Marsh mapping and ecological assessment method to various technical advisory committees, helping with some basic documentation. For next steps, pending funding and interest, we may pull that resiliency up back together to discuss what to do with the new sea level rise projections and whether to redo or adjust those models. We are creating a salt marsh ecological integrity assessment methodology that we'll be using this summer, and we're continuing to support the initiation of long-term sentinel site type monitoring in Maine for those new RSETs, working with the Maine Coastal Program. And that is it. You can see the Coastal Resiliency group members and others that have helped out with all this work. And that's it. Thanks.
My name is Marc Carullo. I'm with the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management. I'm an environmental analyst here and work on a variety of wetland monitoring and assessment projects, mapping projects in support of not only wetlands, but ocean planning and floodplain management and other programs here at CZM. Today I'd like to talk to you about a project where we applied the sea level affecting marshes model to all of Massachusetts. The model developed by Warren Pinnacle Consulting, and we will get into some of the details of that as we move along. Excuse me. First, I'd like to thank EPA Region 1. This was largely funded through a wetland program development grant that we received, as well as some funding from NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. Project team consisted of about a handful of folks from not only CZM, but our Fish and Game Division of Ecological Restoration, our Mass DEP program, Wetlands program, Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole and Giblin, who also hosts the Plum Island Ecosystems LTER up in the Great Marsh, upper North Shore of Massachusetts. And last but not least, Woods Hole Group, a consulting firm that did a lot of the heavy lifting for us and was instrumental in this project. So just go over a few objectives of the project. Back in 2011, the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs released a climate change adaptation report that identified some coastal strategies, which included having a better understanding of what sea level rise impacts would be to our wetlands. And another strategy was to identify opportunities for and barriers to marsh migration. So those were primary objectives of this project, and with this information, we hope to kind of advance planning and prioritization efforts, both at the state level and kind of municipal and nonprofit level as well. So when we talk about marsh migration, we talk about upland marsh migration, but of course, we are most interested as well in what would happen to our both tidal fresh systems and non-tidal systems as marshes transgress into landward. So I'd like to have this slide up. This was stolen from Joseph Smith, I believe used to work with TNC in New Jersey, and it's just kind of a reminder that marsh migration, marine transgression, obviously we know is not something that is static or even new. It's been happening for some time, even recently, and we should expect to see some more of that as our uplands allow. So for this project, we took the 4 sea level rise scenarios from the U.S. National Climate Assessment, Paris et al., 2012, and adapted those to local conditions here in Massachusetts. So we arrived at 4 sea level rise scenarios ranging from 0.82 feet to a little over 7 feet. We ran this model from 2011 to 2100 with time steps at 2030, 50, 70, and 2100. And I should note that those are actually MAP output time steps. We actually ran this model with a decadal interval, so we have data for every 10 years through 2100. And I already mentioned that we used the sea level affecting marshes model. In addition, we were able to apply the marsh equilibrium model to supplement one of the inputs to SLAM, which we'll get into in a bit. So those unfamiliar with SLAM, it's pretty widely used now. It's essentially a glorified bathtub model. It uses a decision tree to determine how sea level rise will lead to conversion of a wetland to a different type. And it tries to incorporate a lot of the main processes that drive that conversion. For our project, as I mentioned, we ran this statewide, which was pretty big undertaking. We carved up the state into 18 different project panels. One, because they were more manageable to actually run the model. It requires a number of large data sets. And 2, because the SLAM model requires direction of open shore, essentially, for calculating fetch. And so this breakout here gave us a good run for the entire state. So there are a variety of inputs to SLAM. We ran SLAM version 6.2. My understanding is I think they're up to 6.7 now, so rapid development in the SLAM world. We start with a digital elevation model, and I'm not going to go through each of these through this talk. I'll point out those in bold. But naturally, having an elevation model is a large requirement. Wetland map data, of course, your model is only going to be good as your data input. And so we'll talk a little bit about wetland map data, as well as accretion rates and tidal range. So for our wetland map data, we use the National Wetland Inventory's 2008-2011 rapid update here in Region 5. And this borrows, essentially consumes the statewide data set, giving us a really good spatial resolution with some tweaks. And herein lies the update, where they crosswalked the state's classification system to NWI, they being NWI, and allowed us to incorporate both regularly flooded marsh and irregularly flooded marsh. So essentially low marsh, regularly flooded marsh, and high marsh, irregularly flooded marsh, which the state's data set does not provide. If I'm not mistaken offhand, I think there were 750 or so different NWI codes that were incorporated into this data set and crosswalked to these SLAM categories you see here on the right. Secondly, I'd like to talk about accretion. As Kristen mentioned in her talk, they didn't feel like they had accretion data to apply to their model. And here in the state of Massachusetts, we have some long-studied salt marshes with surface elevation tables or sets that have been in place for decades, including the Great Marsh and the Plum Island Ecosystems LTER, Cape Cod National Seashore, Waquoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve on the South Cape. So kind of on the northern end of Massachusetts, and then Cape Cod, with really nothing in between. And even within those data sets, we compiled those data sets and reviewed them and determined that we either didn't have enough of a record to make an informed decision about what accretion rate was for any particular area, or there was just too much noise in the data. And so we decided to use the local historical sea level trend for a statewide application. So that would allow us to compare and contrast the different project panels kind of on the same plane. Whereas if we had discrete data for one area versus another, it wouldn't really give us a good picture statewide of what we think might happen to our wetlands. So as you can see here from the graphic on the right, we used a 2.8 millimeter per year static accretion, meaning that through 2100 every year, our marshes, our wetlands, accrete 2.8 millimeters per year in the model. Down to the left and the bottom left there, Buzzards Bay, 2.82 millimeters per year, and then Nantucket with a 3.55 millimeters per year based on the historical sea level trend data for those areas. Now, we also ran SLAM with the time variable accretion data. So we ran the Marsh equilibrium model, which I had mentioned. It was developed by Jim Morris at the University of South Carolina. And Jim had calibrated the Marsh equilibrium model for the Great Marsh up the North Shore of Massachusetts, one of a handful of estuaries that he had calibrated this model for, the others being in South Carolina and the Gulf of Mexico. And with these data, we were able to apply a marsh surface elevation, or really an accretion rate, that accounted for biophysical feedback. So whereas sea level rises, perhaps a marsh may respond by increasing plant productivity below and above ground plant productivity, thereby capturing more sediment from the water and building elevation. But at some point, as sea level rises, perhaps there's a threshold where that marsh is no longer able to sustain that productivity. Plants begin to die off, and the marsh is no longer trapping sediment. And so this gives us that time variable accretion rate that we were seeking, and we were lucky to have this calibrated for an area of Massachusetts, again, which is kind of heavily researched. So we were able to apply both the static accretion rate in the Great Marsh and the time variable accretion rate, or MEM accretion rate. And the last data input I'll talk about for SLAM is tidal range. And so we arrived at tidal range for each of our project panels using the active and historic water level stations that NOAA provides data for. And as you can see here, we classified different tidal ranges in Massachusetts from macro to micro to just better summarize the data and look for trends within those tidal range classes. Now, of course, we've carved up our landscape and have created quite a few tidal restrictions up and down our shores. And so those are really difficult to capture at a statewide scale for this type of project, but we did attempt to do that for 35 different estuaries or different tidal restrictions where we had information on the upstream and downstream water levels for those sites. And so essentially, we should assume that sea level rise will flood these areas differently unless, of course, sea level rise crests a road, for instance, which may be a tidal restriction, and then it would continue. So having this data is, I think, really, really important to get a better, more realistic understanding of how these areas may flood. Of course, we'd like to incorporate more of those in the future, and we'll do so as we collect data or compile data from partners that have data. So I'll just take you quickly through just one scenario here at Boston Harbor panel, just to give you an idea of what the map outputs look like. And we'll go down into the Weymouth Back River down in Weymouth, Massachusetts, which runs into Boston Harbor. And we'll start out at 2011, and you can just take a look at your legend. The brighter green is our regularly flooded marsh or high marsh, and the darker green is regularly flooded marsh or low marsh. And we can just see that tan is tidal flat. We can just see quickly how 2011, 30, 2050, 2070, and 2100 looks based on our 4.5 feet of sea level rise, our intermediate high sea level rise scenario. That's static accretion. Now we could throw impervious surface over this and see that we're not really getting a whole lot of marsh migration down and along the Weymouth Back River. There's an esker up on the west side of the Weymouth Back River, which provides a whole lot of slope and elevation and doesn't allow for a whole lot of migration in this particular area. I should note that we ran SLAM without protecting development. So essentially, SLAM treats all upland the same. It doesn't care if it is forested, if it's pavement, if wetland's going to migrate, if the slope and the conditions are correct, a wetland will migrate. And so that's the output that we arrived with. You can also protect those areas from doing it. Of course, that doubles your model runs and your effort in this project. But at the very least, we wanted to be able to look for opportunities for allowing marsh migration in areas that even have barriers, which we may be able to remedy in the future. Here's another look. So that was the intermediate high sea level rise scenario out through 2100. Here's a look of an area down on the South Cape Cod, in Yarmouth, Parker's River. And here is a look at 2100 of the different sea level rise scenario, ranging from 0.8 feet to 7.1 feet. And clearly you can see there's no legend here, but it's the same that applies. The brighter green is your high marsh, the darker green is your low marsh. And with each scenario, you naturally see potentially more marsh loss out to the high, which is significant marsh loss and nearly depletes that estuary of salt marsh. And it's important to note that this is a microtidal environment as opposed to the Boston Harbor panel, which we looked at, which was a macrotidal environment. So I'm going to show some data from the statewide application using the static accretion rate and 4.5 feet of sea level rise. from 2011 to 2100. It's important to note that there's a number of ways to spin these data, and for this particular presentation, I'd like to just focus on potential change of existing wetland in 2011. Excuse me, existing salt marsh in 2011. So for our high marsh in 2011, out to 2100 with 4.5 feet sea level rise, this model predicts that only 8% of high marsh will persist statewide. Okay, 64% of existing high marsh will be converted to low marsh. So you may think that that's pretty outrageous. Well, there is a significant potential loss of marsh based on this model output and this static accretion rate. But 64% conversion to low marsh still means that low marsh is salt marsh, and it may be just the trend that could potentially go to tidal flat and open water beyond 2100. But right now, high marsh, based on this model output, is looking at significant losses. For our low marsh, only 29% persist. Of course, our low marsh numbers are much lower for statewide. So we have 49,000 or so acres of salt marsh in Massachusetts, so both regularly flooded and irregularly flooded marsh. And I believe it's about 36,000 or so of those acres, or 39,000 of those acres is actually high marsh classified. And so when we add those together, we arrive at 66% of salt marsh persists. So that's a 34% loss of marsh out to 2100 with just 4.5 feet of sea level rise. So I've mentioned that we applied the MEM accretion rate for our Great Marsh panel, and so now I'd just like to compare the static versus MEM accretion in that area. And this is just a quick zoom in of the Merrimack River, out 2100 with 4.5 feet of sea level rise. And as you can see on the left panel, the static accretion, which is a 2.8 millimeters per year, you have a lot of low marsh. So that was formerly high marsh, so there's a big conversion there. With the MEM accretion on the right, you're seeing far less conversion of high marsh to low marsh. And that bears out in these numbers that I'm showing you here. For our high marsh, persisting only 7% under static accretion, but 65% under the MEM accretion. Conversion of high marsh to low marsh, 85% under static and 35% under that time variable MEM accretion. So a lot more hope for our marshes based on what MEM suggests, but still a significant loss, potentially. Maybe less so up in the Great Marsh and our macrotidal environments versus our microtidal environments, which show far greater losses. And that's not really depicted here in these numbers. So, as I said, there are a number of different ways to look at these data. Oh my, forgive me here, I don't believe I'm missing quite a few slides here, apologies. Oh, okay. Apologies, folks. I have the marsh migration slides that are not here, so they somehow were deleted, perhaps, when I finalized this. So I'll just talk about those a little bit. User error. We have, it's a bummer because I was looking forward to showing you a few of those slides. So we have some marsh migration derivatives of this land data set based on the different scenarios of sea level rise that we've been calculating, and yeah, too bad I don't have those. So, so generally statewide, I would say that if the outlook is bleak as SLAM is potentially saying it is, marsh migration corridors are not going to offset those potential losses. But I think, and we think here in the CZM, that they're tremendously beneficial to allow some of the functions and values that these wetlands provide to persist beyond, to 2100 and beyond. And so we intend to work with the land conservation community here, both at the land trust level, but primarily with the state agencies, interacting with what we call the interagency land committee here at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which hosts the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the largest state landholder, and the Department of Fish and Game, another large landholder here in Massachusetts. So prioritizing parcels for protection within those programs and to potentially look at improved land management practices to allow for something like marsh migration to persist and thrive where it's feasible. We've worked with our In Loop Fee program, which is kind of a young program perhaps compared to some of those in the other New England states. But they have recently shown interest in purchasing lands for protection, for coastal wetland protection, and so are very interested in our SLAM outputs and have already used those to inform some of their decisions. We're working with other folks here in the state at the local land trust level and actually statewide land trust level, like the trustees for reservations, have used our data for coastal vulnerability to their natural resources and historical and cultural resources as well. So in addition to prioritizing parcels for protection, we really want to incentivize protection of these marsh migration corridors. We feel like we can do that through state grant programs that allow municipalities and nonprofit organizations to apply and receive funding for land acquisition to promote conservation and recreation. And so there's, I think, great opportunity there to kind of just incentivize marsh migration protection. In the restoration planning community, again, prioritizing restoration sites, whether it be through scenario analysis, removing barriers to migration to see which potential restoration projects would provide us with the most bang for our buck, so to speak. There's a big effort here in Massachusetts for dam removal restoration and cranberry bog restoration, or abandoned cranberry bog restoration of former salt marsh. And so we've already worked with our Division of Ecological Restoration to look at one particular site and show SLAM results there that may or may not be able to help inform that project. In addition, here in Massachusetts, we are starting a statewide strategy, developing a statewide strategy here to build tidal marsh resilience. Going to identify research and data gaps and recommendations to promote tidal marsh resiliency. And of course, outreach and education is a primary component, and we've taken this at various stages on the road and have worked with our conservation committee networks and commission networks, and everyone from an informed interested citizen to municipal officials and land trusts. Just kind of getting people up to date on the latest data that we have available and how they may be able to use this in their programs. So with that said, there is a technical report available at the CZM website, and we are soon to release a SLAM viewer, an interactive web mapping application that will provide all the data for our different sea level rise scenarios, go into methods a bit and some summary results, and within time we will update this viewer with marsh migration corridors that we've identified in a number of different formats. I've already mentioned the funding and project team. I'd like to just take a note to the data contributors that either contributed tidal restriction data, surface elevation table data that we did or did not use in other data sets, including the models that were used for this particular project. And I'm happy to take any questions.
The question for Kristen comes from Kathleen Walls in New Jersey. Are there salinity models based on water quality monitoring that are guiding the migration model by tidal marsh type?
No, that's the short answer. Again, we just really didn't see that there was a consistent enough source of data, whether it was salinity or otherwise up and down the state, that could help us with that prediction for type. So we just went with adjacency as kind of the rule.
Another question, can water quality monitoring be added to future Sentinel sites to get that salinity data? So that's a follow-up question from Kathleen.
Yeah, that would be great. And we're currently in the midst of, in terms of where those Sentinel sites are going to be and what the methodology is going to be, what metrics we would use, that's all under development right now. So that's certainly something we would look at. And even to get a better sense of where salinity is being tracked or measured, we could maybe start to see how much like that across the landscape. So that's a good suggestion I'll keep in mind. Thanks, Kathleen.
And a question for Marc on the timeline around the SLAM viewer, when you think that might be available?
That's a great question. I thought it would be available already, but unfortunately, due to perhaps some technical difficulties, we were not able to get that running. So I would expect that to go live. I want to be a little conservative here, so I'll say within the next month, perhaps. Mid-spring, taking us into mid-spring.
So you should see here their contact information. If you do want to send them an email or follow up on anything that they've presented today, we certainly welcome you to do that. You can also reach out to me with any questions or comments about the webinar series. So we'll go ahead and conclude the webinar. Thank you, and we'll hopefully see you again April 9th for the next in the series.